welcome to Found in Translation, a weekly-ish exploration of one fellow's translation of the Christian scriptures, one-ish chapter at a time. I'm Brandon Rhodes, and across the internet from me is the translator himself, Brandon Johnson. Hi, Brandon.
Hey, Brandon.
Good to see you this wonderful morning.
Yeah, you too.
How you doing?
Oh, pretty good. Just noticing on the screen here my new mug. One of our friends saw this at a thrift store and got it for me. It's a picture of a labyrinth, and it says "An Amazing Beings Cup."
Wow.
And on the back, it has some encouragements about managing stress and being present in the moment.
So, if you're right-handed and holding it as you are, the rest of us see this lovely image and a cone, and you have a little cheat sheet of how to suffer them.
Right.
On the other side. That's great. Yep. I would love more cheat sheet mugs.
Yeah.
That's great. I'm just drinking out of a blue mug from the Jacksonville Inn.
It's a very nice looking mug, though. It's got a nice shape. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of hard to hold. That's not exactly ergonomic.
Yeah.
But it is what is on the inside that matters. Well, we are going to be talking this week about Ephesians chapter 5, verses 1 through 17. This is the part of the letter that happens in so many of these letters from Paul, where he just loves listing things in an exhortative way. First part, he's exploring all the meanings of things and retelling the story, and then it hones more and more into this cadence of therefores and lists of the kind of things that lead to other kinds of things, and the kind of things you should stick with and the kind of things you should avoid. So in a list like that, it's where you find a lot of, in this case anyway, a lot of individual translation changes, each of which are worth a good conversation, but there's so many of them all here that we'll go deep on a couple of them, but a lot more of them are going to be skimmed. So I think it's important up front. We're gonna tell you a little bit more about some of the bigger interpretive paradigms that showed up more focally here than elsewhere. So we'll get into that in a minute. As always, it's worth letting you know, if you haven't had a chance to read Brandon's translation, we're going to have it up on the screen for those of you watching. For those of you reading, we've got a link in the episode notes so you can read it there. And if you are a member of the community, if you're supporting this podcast financially, then you'll also have comment access there. So we're going to hit pause here on the audio so you can give it a read, and so I can set it up for those of you watching. We'll be right back. All right. So, Brandon, please give us a bit of context here, both in Ephesians and some of the interpretive priorities.
Yeah, well, I think first I remember last time we were in chapter 4 and kind of looked back to earlier in chapter 4, and then even peeked a little bit at this chapter, this section here, because you just really can't do understanding, both for interpretation, but even for translating words. One word could be translated multiple ways. You have to know what is the context of what we're talking about to help make that decision.
Yeah.
So I think just like that here, it's really important to remember where we just came from in chapter 4. It's all about putting things together with love, building those connections, assembling all the different people who make up the church into one church, one body, one temple. All the different images that get used for that. And what does love mean? It's not about affection. It's about being committed to the goodness and the benefit and well-being of the people you are loving, and taking action to try to pursue that well-being for them. Which starts to get into this chapter of like, here are all the things that you need to do or not do that push in that direction, right? And we talked about the get angry. There are things that should make you angry, that come out of that shadowed mind, or that meaning the darkness, that ineffective thinking.
Right.
And don't let the sun set on the cause of your anger. And I think we go more into that here. Like, it's really talking about like, yeah, keep holding things up to the light, making sure that they don't get missed, that they're not just being able to hide in secret, that we keep talking about them, we keep looking at them until they're done away with. Just mentioning it once or twice is not enough. So, but yeah, we'll get into how I came to those connections as we go, but that's kind of what I found here.
That's great.
Yeah.
So should we start with a reading once through?
Sure.
Start picking through some of these.
Yeah, we can maybe start with the first paragraph.
Yeah, just do that.
Yeah, it's those first 5 verses. Therefore, become people who imitate God, like beloved children, and walk with love, just like Christ also loved us and handed himself over for us, an offering and sacrifice to God for a sweet fragrance. So sexual exploitation and all uncleanness or greed must not even be identifiable among you, as is important for the sacred. Also remove obscenity and harassment or demeaning joking, which is out of line, but practice gratitude instead. Understand this, you who have knowledge. Everyone who is sexually unethical or unclean or greedy, which means they practice idolatry, has no inheritance in the reign of Christ and God. Some strong words there.
Yeah, he doesn't pull too many punches. Yeah, and the first place that grabbed me in all this is the language of sexual exploitation. It's usually fornication or sexual immorality. That's the kind of language that's typically used here.
Yeah, it's sexual immorality works. It's broad like that. Sexual exploitation could be a little more narrow than what the Greek is saying here. But there's a couple of reasons that I went for sexual exploitation instead. Being one, learning that porneia, that's traditionally sexual exploitation, shares the root with pernemi, which is to sell.
So the word that's usually translated is something like sexual immorality.
Yeah, it comes from the verb to sell.
That's a hint.
Yeah.
That's a hint.
And so like porne, that, like the slight changes in the word, is a noun that means like a sex worker selling sex, right? So porneia has to do with like sex for sale in some way, basically. But maybe not literally a transaction with money, always. So yeah, fornication, however, which is what the NRSV uses, and I usually like NRSV well enough. It's my maybe like least bad option.
Yep. Same.
Yeah. But it's got some like older language because it was done many decades ago at this point. But fornication is just wrong.
That's what they're saying.
Yeah. Yeah. Where sexual exploitation may be a little too narrow, fornication is extremely too narrow.
Yeah. Because you look it up in the dictionary and it's like sex outside of marriage.
Right. It's just like, you're not married and you had sex. End of definition. Like,
which is an interpretive decision. It's a existing ethical framework that is being imported into this word porneia.
Yeah. No, I won't go into it too much, but I think some of the early church's understanding of porneia anyway had some connections with a long list of sexual ethics that are from Leviticus. I want to say 17 through 20.
That's
I
what
might be off. Yeah, okay. I was gonna say I might be off by chapter 2, but yeah, if it's 17 through 20. So like there's a whole list, including like don't have sex with animals, don't have sex with family members, don't have sex with your husband's wife. Like, yeah, just don't. Like there's a lot of problems with all of that. So I think that's some of what's in mind, but I think part of why some of those are problematic is because they're exploitative. So maybe not every single one of them, but a lot.
Yeah. So the challenge here is finding what's a phrase that captures, like, what's the heart of what Paul is concerned about here?
Yeah.
Because it's not just generally
right
coloring outside the lines of
it's not just like there are arbitrary rules that God is using as a test to make sure you measure up and you didn't hit all the boxes. That's not what this is. Like, looking in the context, this is about, are you causing people harm or not? Are you working towards people's well-being, or trying to numb yourself and make yourself just like find pleasures at other people's expense? Period.
Yeah,
that's that context of chapter 4 that we were talking about.
So translating it in a way that leaves the door wide open for, and there are some really seemingly arbitrary rules around sex that the internal logic of it is inscrutable. It's just a matter of, well, we're pretty sure God said that. So if you can understand Paul,
there's always a why. There's always a reason why.
There is, like, these aren't just arbitrary lists of thou shalt nots. The heart of where Paul is going is humanize one another. Don't reduce each other. Don't other one another. Don't it one another. Always be moving to thou one another, as Rabbi Buber would say.
Yeah, like, so that sounds like a Martin Buber reference.
It is. Like, that's the trajectory here. Sexuality that humanizes and honors and has mutuality. Like, that's what we want in all relationships, all the more so in conjugal union. So to have it be, actually, here's just some arbitrary lists, is, even if that list happens to be correct, let's just work with that. It's not actually forming people to think ethically. Thinking ethically is not only having the best memorization of where all the invisible fences are. That doesn't form you. That doesn't form your affections or your critical thinking or
learning
your
some
life.
Rules is good when you just have no idea what it means to make ethical decisions. But at some point, you grow beyond that and start to understand why, and be able to make your own decisions based on the values that you've picked up, that those rules helped you figure out. But the rules are not the point.
Yeah, just in the same way that, like, the stripes on the road are not the actual path or destination.
Yeah, they help you keep you from crashing into something.
That's right, or someone else.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Anyhow, I think that broad interpretation is going to be helpful to say up front for all kinds of subsequent translations.
Yep. Yeah, and when it's fornication, it just gets used as a weapon to instill shame. When it's sexual exploitation, it actually starts to protect people from being harmed, and that's one of our commitments. So.
Yeah. So, yeah, a commitment in your translation work has been, and we haven't said it quite very often until fairly recently this way, harm reduction. And if there's a place where a translation that may be the dominant translation it may be equally accurate to the Greek. It may not be faithful to the Greek. if that makes sense. I mean, it's not
Yeah,
faithful
to
to
the
the
Greek
spirit.
in context of
Yeah,
the scripture
to
of
like the
Jesus
rest
and
of the
Paul,
sentence.
and
It's like,
yeah,
and if that accurate but unfaithful translation has a legacy of being weaponized to cause shame, alienation, exile, and smallness, why wouldn't we go with an equally accurate translation? It would be unfaithful to Christ for you to stick with a translation just because it's accurate or dominant. If it's
right,
hurting people.
right. Yeah, and so one of the biggest takeaways I think that this project has brought to the forefront for me over and over again, and I hope other people are receiving this idea, is not that necessarily I have the most correct. We've talked about that before. Like the just the idea that there could be more than one correct way. That's huge to me. Like,
yes.
And deciding between various potential best translations is always going to involve values and what you already understand about the world and about scripture and spirituality and God and yourself and people, and all of that's getting pulled into that for everyone, not just me, not just the NET's committee, not just the NRSV's committee, everybody. And there isn't only one way to do it.
Preach. So the next line that is worth acknowledging here is actually just the rest of that start of the sentence there. So sexual exploitation and all uncleanness or greed must not even be identifiable among you.
Yeah.
It's funny that it goes from and to or.
It is.
What the hell is happening there?
Well, I'm not totally sure, honestly. It's definitely intentional, because usually when there's a list, it's like and there's no commas in Greek. Or it's or depending on what we're talking about. But the fact that it switches is not very common, and it seems meaningful. There are different things that it could be meaning, and so you see that show up in different translations. The NET takes it to mean like one of the Greek word kai, that's and, can also mean like more specifically, like kind of clarifying something, narrowing it down a bit. And that's how the NET deals with it. So it takes what I've translated here as all uncleanness as kind of expanding on sexual exploitation. So sexual exploitation, all uncleanness, or in their translation, they say sexual immorality, impurity of any kind, as kind of an explanatory there. And then, or greed. NRSV does something weird too, where they lump the first two together like that and then put commas on either side of or greed, which ends up having the effect in the sentence of kind of like making greed like an afterthought, like it's just like a slight aside. Oh yeah, this is worth mentioning, but we're not going to pay attention to it too closely. And again, things like commas are always decisions by the translator. They didn't exist in the Greek. In fact, not only were there not chapter divisions, verse numbers, there were no commas, there were no paragraph breaks, there was no punctuation of any kind. There wasn't even spaces between the words.
Really?
All of that stuff is added later by people who are trying to like, this is what makes sense to us as we're looking at it and trying to make sense out of it.
Yeah.
Wow.
So you didn't put any commas in there. You just
not in this part. Yeah.
You retained the and or.
Yeah.
Let it stay a bit agnostic.
Yes, and some of that is trying to like, I'm going to let the reader kind of do what they will with this. I tend to think that the uncleanness and greed are actually more closely connected than the exploitation and uncleanness. But that's just me trying to make sense of it. It's not about the grammar.
Mm-hmm.
I think I mentioned, it might have been last time, that I as I keep coming back to where the word uncleanness comes up, that it has to do with like coming back to ceremonial regulations in Torah about like it's not about what's gross.
Yeah.
It's not about sex specifically, which at least in the culture I grew up in, we start talking about impurity in church context, you're talking about sex.
Yeah.
But it really isn't in scripture.
No.
So it has to do, the context was like, does it break this rule? Does it make someone so that they're not allowed to join in temple worship?
Mm-hmm.
That was how it was being talked about in the day. And Jesus says, nah, that's not what's important. It's how you treat each other that's important. And I think Paul keeps up that sense. So sexploitation and treating each other poorly or greed. So I think that's, if anything, it leans closer to greed, but you know, if we're talking about exploitation versus immorality, it could go with either one. But
yeah, it's almost like, so sexual exploitation and all uncleanness, parenthetically, greed,
could be,
or comma, both of which are kind of greedish, comma.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Like especially if sexual exploitation, if porneia is grammatically related to in some way sale, or like problem, and it's now problematic sale,
right,
or problematic exchange. Well, yeah, like greed, to like the problematic way of looking at a person of sexual desire for you, what we would conventionally call lust. That's related to what happens when I'm browsing like the new MacBooks online. And I fixate and I desire, and it's like it's a not, desire is fine, desire is great, but there's something else and weird that gets on.
You took a turn there. I was like, what are you browsing online, Brent?
Yeah.
But yeah,
laptops.
Yeah.
Or whatever it is you like to.
Yeah, but if it's that context of chapter 4 again, that self-soothing, that numbing, the like just seeking the pleasure of the moment, regardless of how it affects anybody else.
Yeah.
Whether it's greed and taking from them, whether that's literally taking an object or exploiting labor, or exploiting a body and for pleasure,
or seeing something for more or less than what it is. Like if you reduce another human, like sex is not something lower than being human. I want to be careful there. But if you limit,
but turning a person into an object that's designed just to please you and not as a relational mutuality.
There's complications there.
Right.
And then the converse of like when you see something that you really want, like a computer or car or whatever it is that you are really hot for, you're seeing it as more than what it actually is. It's an inability to see truthfully. So that wisdom of Martin Buber of it, do you see others as it or as thou?
Right.
I think that's close to the heart of what's being seen here. And capitalism and exploitive sexuality both go from thou to it.
Right. Yeah. It occurred to me that in human trafficking, they're generally divided into two types of human trafficking: exploiting labor or exploiting for sex, creating modern day slaves right here in the United States.
Yeah.
Being enslaved and often being imported from another country to work in kitchens with little or no pay, or other kinds of labor exploitation, or teens being shipped up and down the I-5 corridor to be used for sex by people. And I think that all fits exactly what we're talking about here.
So if we move on to verse 4, and and remove obscenity and harassment or demeaning jokes, which is out of line. Practice gratitude instead. So those three, obscenity, harassment, demeaning jokes. So let's do quick.
Yeah.
On those, yeah.
Yeah. Obscene. NRSV uses obscene talk. NAT does vulgar speech. They're fine. It's kind of outdated for vulgar. But obscenity or obscene, if you look in the dictionary, we use it to mean something, to mean a lot of things kind of casually, but the actual meaning of the word does specifically have to do with like sexual grossness.
In the English word obscenity.
The English word obscenity, yeah. And that's a reflection. The reason that's an appropriate translation is because that's what the Greek word here means too. It is specific, and the context too pushes it even further in that direction here. So it's not just like don't use obscene language, like don't say shit, for instance. That's, I mean, that may or may not be a good direction. Whatever, that's not what we're talking about here. It's specifically about being sexually inappropriate in some way.
Like there are words that, like, it's not like when Paul says, don't be obscene, don't use obscenity. It's not, I've got in mind some words that haven't even been developed yet, but in every language, there will be words that God will kick the shit out of you for saying the word shit. That's weird.
Yeah.
Like it's reducing it to Paul as baptizer of whatever means politeness in a given culture, which is so boring and small and often racist.
Yes, and also that. Yeah.
Ugh.
Yeah.
What is it actually? What is the Greek?
I have to look it up.
Yeah. I mean, you'll have to know the word, but like, what's the spirit of?
It's the sexual grossness. It's, that you're not going to find that in a resource as the definition, but that's the heart of it. Which isn't about like you do something sexual that grosses me out, like it's like, no, you're doing something like someone like Louis C.K. masturbating in front of someone else is basically a form of assault in a non-consenting person.
Yeah, in a power relationship.
Obscene. Yep. That's sexually gross. Like, don't do that. That's not okay. That's what we're talking about here. Not like you do a sexual position at home with your partner in consenting that I would find gross, so you're obscene. That's not what it's talking about. It's not that you have a partner that I would not be attracted to. That's not what we're talking about.
So it seems like harassment is is kind of related to that in some way. I mean, it goes beyond sexual. So what's this next word here that?
Traditionally it's foolishness, which isn't, again, like we talked about earlier, it's not wrong per se. It's kind of meaningless at this point.
Foolish talk, you can call anything foolish.
The Greek is morologia, so like it's a compound word, moros logia, like where we get the word moron, which literally means like thoughtless, without thought. So another way to translate this would be like thoughtless speech, or maybe impulsive speech, or careless speech. But then thinking context, both in this spot here, but also how foolish moros is used throughout the scripture. It's not just like, wow, that guy's not very smart. It really is consistently throughout the entire scripture of doing actions that cause harm. So here it's saying things that cause harm. And harassment might be too narrow, but that is that's kind of why I went with it. And having this context of a lot of sexually specific, harmful ways of talking is what led me to go with harassment. But it could be thoughtless speech or something.
Thoughtless or reckless or brainless.
Yeah, impulsive. Yeah. But I'm saying something without thinking about the fact that this might feel demeaning for this person, degrading in some way, harmful.
Yeah.
Which leads us into the next one, was demeaning joking.
Demeaning joking. It's usually coarse jesting.
Which
crude joking.
Right, which are all just really archaic English, I think. We still use the word crude, but and vulgar a little bit. Coarse, not to mean that. Talk about it like a physical texture of something being coarse, maybe. But yeah. But yeah, the point of it isn't, again, it's not that I said the word shit, like in a joke, and it offended somebody. Like,
and St. Paul is like, how dare you?
Right. It is joking about someone, saying a joke intended to make someone uncomfortable, or that makes someone feel less than, whether it's intended or not. It's not okay. And that doesn't mean that you're a bad person if you tell a joke and didn't realize that it would make someone feel bad. But once it's brought to your attention, stop it. Don't defend yourself. Stop it. There's a proverb. I thought about looking it up, but I forgot to do that. But somewhere in Proverbs, it specifically says, like, it's not okay to use the excuse, I was only joking.
Yeah, it's such a comment. It was a joke. It's like, well,
lighten up, snowflake. It's like, no, it's not okay to harm people with your words. Yeah,
it's not a virtue for you to be able to make those jokes, and it's not a like weakness or problem. It's not my problem that I was bothered by you making that joke about those people or that person.
Yeah, because it's out of line.
Yeah, so demeaning really gets at it's stretching the Greek, but it's actually more faithful to the broader flow of the kind of stuff Paul is talking about here. Don't reduce each other. Like, Gentiles don't make jokes about the Jews. Don't make
crude. I think that's the point of it, is that it's demeaning.
And let's see, do we want to do sexual and unethical here before getting into the next paragraph?
Yeah, which it's that's another one where it's like, I'm gonna try this out, see how it goes, but I'm not fully confident in it either. It's related to the word that I did earlier as sexual exploitation, or that traditional sexual immorality, but it's one of those variations, right? We talked about pernemi being to sell, porneia being this sexual immorality exploitation, porne being a female sex worker. This is pornos, which could be translated as male sex worker, or perhaps someone involved in it, like a pimp, or John, someone who's benefiting from the sex work in some way, whether it's as the seller or the buyer. But in general, someone who's sexually unethical, I think those words porne and pornos, both for the sex workers of either gender, either grammatical gender, can be used kind of metaphorically to mean someone engaging in these like exploitative practices in a lot of contexts. So it's not as narrow as literally someone who that's their way of making a living, but it could be. It absolutely could be, because that's the literal meaning of it. But.
Great. Well, let's move down to this next paragraph, shall we?
Sure.
We're not going to read what we have at the very bottom on the screen there. That's going to be more for reference. Which is
for people listening, is the ESV's version of this.
Yeah, the English Standard Version, which is the extra sexist version. Am I making a coarse joke or am I being accurate? Let the listener understand.
I think you might be being in the light there. So.
Yeah. So these lists and these sequence of translations, it's going to be really helpful to be able to just quickly see and catch the contrast of especially one after another. Like some of you watching, if we were going down a path you didn't care about, you've probably already hit mute and read through all this. But we're going to go ahead and do that now. Brandon, can you read verses 6 through 17, please, in your translation?
Yeah. Let no one deceive you with empty words, because these things are the cause of God's anger toward those who refuse to be persuaded. Therefore, do not become co-participants with them, since you used to be darkness, but now are light with the Lord. Walk like children of light. The fruit of light consists of every beneficial thing and justice and truth, seeking to learn what is pleasing to the Lord. Do not be co-participants in the fruitless actions of the darkness, but even expose them instead. It feels shameful even to speak of the things they are doing with secrecy, but everything exposed by the light becomes visible, since everything that becomes visible is light. That's why it says, "Wake up, you who are asleep. Get up from among the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Therefore, watch attentively how you walk, not like the unwise, but like the wise, making the moment count, since the days are full of oppression. Because of this, do not be oblivious. Instead, make the connection about what the Lord's desires are."
Word of the Lord. So the first phrase that we've got highlighted on the screen is, because these things are the cause of God's anger. The ESV has it as, because of these things, the wrath of God comes.
Yeah, which is not wrong. I made a couple of decisions there. One, changing wrath to anger, because again, wrath is just importing like 400-year-old English into a current translation, which is not an appropriate thing to do. The word wrath, orge, in the Greek is not specific to God, and in our current context, we talk about anger. Is that feeling that
yeah.
So
it's also
that's
just a religious
there.
technical term.
Right.
There's entire religious constructs built around, like, we are objects destined for wrath, and Christ's death saved us from God's wrath, and it's an expression of God's glory and holiness and justice. That the only way, like, God's anger, his righteous response to brokenness, sin, evil, whatever it is, harm and alienation, is a wrath that must be resolved. It's a really, like, I need violence to get this out of me. I'm so angry about the violence that I need more violence to get over it.
Yeah.
And like, what a crazy
sense.
ass system this is.
Yeah.
So to just like, let's just change that word. We're just not going to give the devil a foothold here.
Yeah. I mean, it's not really about changing it. It's about like making it more accurate, honestly. It's not like, oh, that's the right word, but I don't like it, so I'm changing it. It's
right. It's more accurate, and it's also harm reduction. Like, we're not gonna leave the door open for any of that bullshit. No.
Yeah, not like giving a platform for the false accuser.
There it is.
Yeah. The other change in this little bit is the phrase "cause of God's anger," which I did to make it reminiscent of "cause of your anger" in the previous verse, but it is a different wording in the Greek. But it still works. Where they have "for because of," it's still saying that these things, because of these things, means these things are the cause of the wrath of God in the ESV link, right?
Yeah.
So I just kind of moved it around a little bit to highlight like, hey, there's a connection here in what's being talked about.
That's great. Next thing you changed here is those who refuse to be persuaded. It's conventionally the sons of disobedience.
Yeah.
Wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience versus because these things are the cause of God's anger towards those who refuse to be persuaded. That feels like a change.
Yeah, a couple of changes. The sons of is a really common idiom in the Greek, meaning those who have kind of committed themselves to a way of being. A lot of like American Revolution talk about the sons of liberty.
Yeah.
It's like they're committed to pursuing liberty kind of at all costs, right? You know?
Yeah, it's a way of being human.
Yeah. So
the Proud Boys.
Yeah, other trends. Please no.
Sorry, no cursing. No coarse language here.
Right. Yeah, so other like the NET and stuff do those who are disobedient or something like that. They don't bring it, trying to clarify that the sons of is an idiom and not like somehow literal. But the word is not just like, it really has to do with being persuaded. So maybe there's a connection between obedience, I suppose, and persuaded if the person doing the persuading is your boss, and you're disobeying a direct order or something, you know, like,
yeah,
there is a connection there. But the word itself in the Greek has to do with being persuaded. So it's those who refuse to be persuaded, which starts to make me think of like when you call people out and they're just like, no, that's, you don't put that on me, like,
or like just dismissing something as fake news when it's like, no, I just literally reported a fact.
Right. Yeah.
Just because it was inconvenient.
Yeah. And I think, go ahead.
I'm just amazed at the Greek, because when I first read this, I thought persuaded versus disobedience are totally different. They're very different. Disobedience is like a law, rule, lane keeping kind of word. It's a helpful word. Persuaded, that's just different. That's about like conviction and belief and
maybe more like in this context about conviction, rather than just like, I believe this piece of information versus this piece of information. It does have to do with how my understanding influences how I live.
Okay. But you're saying the Greek is more in the direction of the apprehension than rule keeping.
Being willing to change your alignment, your allegiance to a way of being. And where I actually first made the decision to translate that Greek word that way, as opposed to obedience, was earlier in Ephesians in chapter 2. So I wanted to kind of bring this up, that put it in some context. So Ephesians 2:1-2 reads, "It is you who were lifeless through your shortfalls and deviations, with which you used to walk, conforming with the age mapped out by this world system and conforming to the standard of the one who rules by the authority of the lowest atmosphere and the spirit breath now at work in those who refuse to be persuaded." So it's those who refuse to be persuaded are the ones who are still aligned with the way of the world, the world system, fitting it and conforming to that standard of being, to the standard of the authority of the lowest atmosphere, which could be the false accuser, could be Caesar in this original context, could be other current equivalents to Caesar in that setting. However you want to look at it, it's in opposition to the way of Christ. And having that commitment to being conformed to that way of being and refusing to be persuaded to change that to be conforming to the way of Christ.
So the next two go together. Therefore, do not become co-participants with them, and then do not be co-participants in verse 11. In ESV, it's do not become partners with them or take no part in. That's doesn't seem like a big change. What sticks out to you about it?
Yeah, it's, and then like NET does do not be sharers with them and do not participate in. Yeah, it's not a huge shift.
Not consequential.
But not by itself. Yeah. The idea though is not about like do not become partners with them. Has feels to me like it's like don't have any connection with them at all. Don't interact with them. But it's much more about don't do the things they're doing along with them. So it's a very slight shift, but I think it matters. Because it's not about who your friends are or who your coworkers are. It's about what are you doing that's the same as what they're doing, or maybe even enabling them to do it.
Yeah, and I think there's a one thing I appreciate about this shift is there's a wider sense in Scripture that there are energies and momentums that we can participate in and have resonance. Our lives, our affections, our desires, our communities can have resonance in. There we can participate in and have the energy of malice and harm and alienation and fear and blame and shame. Or we can be co-participants, as St. Peter says, partakers of the divine life,
right?
And be participating in the life of the Christ, in the renewal of the world, and bearing witness to the crucified one, and justice, mercy, kindness, humility, all these things. These are like almost latent energies in this amazing created world. So participation language, co-participation language is, I think, just truer of the way that the divine works and what it means to be human. So it does have, it cracks the door open, helpfully to me, to some commitments I have from reading folks like Teilhard and others.
Yeah.
Ilia Delio, shout out to her.
Always a good shout out.
Yeah. I didn't know you've read her.
I haven't. I've more heard her be a guest on podcasts and stuff like that.
She's so good.
Yeah.
Okay. So now that I've fanboyed enough about Elia Delio, she's so good. Verse 12. You have it as it feels shameful. And the extra sexist version has, for it is shameful to even speak about these things.
Right.
Shame is a big theme for you.
It is a big theme for me, and it's if we're talking about harm reduction, probably every single choice towards harm reduction is really a choice towards removing shaming from the text.
Yeah. How does this do that?
Well, the thing is that in the ESVs, it is shameful. It really sounds like a judgment about, like, speaking of things as bad, don't do it. Which is, I think, the opposite of what it's actually saying here.
Like, it keeps read the rest of the sentence.
Right. Like, bring it into the light. Don't let it be a secret. Keep saying it up. Wake up to it. Like, pay attention. Make sure it's known. And then, but don't talk about it. What? Be ashamed of talking about it, even. Like, hide away. Don't shame. Don't shame yourself by talking about it. It makes no sense. The thing is, shame is an emotion. Speaking about something can't be an emotion per se. It can be something that inspires an emotion, that prompts an emotion. So if I were to put in the word embarrassing here, It is embarrassing even to speak of the things they do in secret. I think that's what it's saying.
Like things are not shameful.
Right.
Feeling
They cause a
shameful is a
feeling,
feeling.
maybe.
Yeah.
Right. It's embarrassing even to speak of the things they do in secret, but if anything is supposed to light, it becomes visible and becomes light. So speak about it, even though it feels embarrassing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I did add the word shameful, because shame is an emotion. It feels shameful. It feels embarrassing even to speak of the things that happen.
Mm-hmm.
And that turns it to like a description of what it's talking about, rather than a judgment and a command. Don't do it. It's bad. And I think, even though that's not explicitly what the ESV is saying, I guarantee you that's how everybody reads it.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, we've got 4 left here. So in verse 16, you have making the moment count, and ESV has making the best use of the time.
Right. Any cheetahs taking advantage of every opportunity, which I kind of like. Also, making the moment count, making this use of the opportunity. It's a small shift, probably fine, but the making the best use of the time to me feels like an ongoing way, I guess. Like, whereas the word is kairos, not chronos.
Oh.
Chronos being kind of like the concept of time as it moves forward,
Mm-hmm.
and kairos being a specific point in time. So make the moment count. Maybe make each moment count, since the days are full of oppression. So you got to like make decisions that are actively doing the things, counting in the ways that this paragraph is talking about, of bringing things to light, leading towards well-being for everyone, right? And justice and truth, bringing things to the truth. Like, so rather than just like making the best use of time, feels a little bit like, just don't waste any time. Don't be idle. Don't lounge around. Be productive. It doesn't explicitly say it, but that's kind of the feeling I get from it. So
sure. Well, the next phrase is because since the days are full of oppression, or in the ESV, the days are evil.
Right. Yeah, and we've talked about this, especially in Matthew.
Oh yeah,
but it's worth coming back to that. I don't ever use the word evil. It's outdated and unnecessarily like judgmental. Oppression isn't good. So there is some judgment worth doing, right? But it's not about just like like supervillain kind of evil, right? It's talking about like hardship, oppression, that kind of things, like situations that cause harm. That's what it's talking about. That's what the word means, paneros. And back when all we like started like really firming up the kinds of English words that we wanted to use as technical terms, 400 years ago, that's really a lot of what evil meant, was like hardship. So not only, but it's part of it. So I think this is a more faithful to the word paneros, is oppression. Yeah, the next one being oblivious, it goes back, it's the same word that we talked about earlier with harassment. They're like
or foolish.
Yeah, it was compound before. It was like foolish speech, specifically foolish talking. This is just foolish. That like I said earlier, that core meaning being like thoughtlessness, carelessness,
okay,
impulsivity maybe, and fitting with the like darkness and light metaphors, the shadowed thinking imagery from the previous. Like, so don't be oblivious, don't be thoughtless in like just refusing to pay attention. to what's happening here, but
Mhm.
pay attention to what's being illuminated as you're exposing things to the light.
Mm.
And engaging in making those connections about what you're seeing and what the Lord's desires actually are.
Yeah, so that's the final phrase. Instead, make the connection about the Lord's desires are, instead of, but understand what the will of the Lord is.
Yeah. The word, there's several different words that can be translated as understand, and the one here specifically has to do with putting things together, making connections.
Religamenting.
Yeah. So I like using make the connection to translate that word specifically for that reason. It makes it more active, like it's something that I'm working to do mentally. I'm making the connection versus like just understand. It's kind of like you do or
Get
you
it
don't.
into your head. Yeah.
Right. And it's, I don't know that I have a choice whether I understand something or not. I can work toward understanding, but just like deciding understand or like, okay, how would that work? But
yeah. And then the other big change here is, instead of what the will of the Lord is, you have what the Lord's desires are.
right. Which we talked about some in our first episode in Ephesians. That word that traditionally is translated will when it's about God is no different than just wanting to or desiring something when that's used about anything and everything, from the like I want another cup of coffee to I really have a strong desire to grow in my understanding of scripture, or I want to like be a better husband, or like all these like much larger kinds of things. It's the same word.
It's such a, I guess the circles I spent some time in had such a fixation on like, what is the will of the Lord? And how do I know that I am in the will of the Lord? How do I know what God's will is for my life, for this situation?
Right. And there's only one option, but of 10,000 wrong options.
Yeah. There's only one right way. The Lord has one will here, because a will is it's understood as this like one outcome and getting a path towards that outcome. And you better figure it out, which makes God just the most disappointed thing of all and conceivable. Because what? So if you're training, if we're being formed by this story and by one another to figure out what the will of God is, it's so fundamentally anxious and narrow. If you learn to make the connection about what the Lord's desires are, what God's affections, longings, and dreams are, you have much more flexibility. It's the difference between learning what to think and learning how to think. It's learning how to feel as God feels and try to discern the deeper hopes of God.
Right. Yeah. And it's not about like at 10:51 a.m. on a Friday morning.
Yeah.
Am I supposed to talk about this line on the page or this line on the page? And if I choose the wrong one, God's going to be mad at me because it wasn't God's will. It's the context, like, do I choose ways of interacting with people that cause harm and are just meant to satisfy making me feel better in the moment? Or do I choose ways of being that seeks good and well-being for everyone and bridges connection and brings people together? That's the context of this. That's what this is talking about. God's making the connection that that's what God's desires are.
Come on.
Yeah.
Well, my desire.
Yeah, it's like we're out of material here, right?
Yeah. My desire is to keep this going in another week.
Yeah.
And to do that, we're going to have to wrap this episode up.
Right. And we're doing that here, even though in most translations, this is in the middle of a paragraph.
Yeah.
which we'll talk about next time, is grammatically incorrect. I've said, sometimes there's like multiple different correct ways to do things. It's not so here. The grammar demands that this is the break between thoughts.
The will of the grammar
Yeah.
is
Obviously,
not
there's
here.
no, like I said earlier, there's no like paragraph breaks formatting wise in the Greek, but thought wise, this is where the thought breaks.
Yeah.
Um,
And what's on the other side of that break? Find out next week.
that's right.
So thank you as always for your company for this leg of the journey, everybody. The easiest way to support Found in Translation is to leave us a rating or review or a thumbs up or a share in whatever app or platform you're experiencing this on. That makes it easier for more people to find the show. And if you want to throw in some words there with a comment or a share or a review to let other people know what these conversations mean to you, all the more so. Second best way to support this show is to become a sponsor. You can do that for just $5 a month. When you do that, you get comment access on the Translations Google Doc and the satisfaction of knowing that you are supporting exceptionally nerdy independent media. You can find the link to join the community in the show notes. Today's music is by Kevin MacLeod at incompetech.com. Found in Translation was produced by Perry FM on unceded Chinook land. Goodbye, Brandon.
Bye, Brandon.
Bye, everybody.